Hello everyone, we're reading the story of the Bible today in the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. The first story of 1 Samuel is the story of Hannah. Why are you crying? Elkanah asked his wife, Hannah. Now Elkanah had two wives. His other wife, Peninnah, was unkind to Hannah and made her life misery. Also, poor Hannah had no children, but Peninnah had many children, both boys and girls. Elkanah loved Hannah, but still she was unhappy and longed every day for God to give her a son. Each year, the family went to worship the Lord before the ark of God in Shiloh. Elkanah provided a feast for the family, but Hannah did not want anything to eat. She went to the tent of worship to pray and to ask God again if he would not give her a son. Eli the high priest was sitting at the door. He saw Hannah kneeling down and looking forwards. Her lips were moving but no words came. Tears ran down on her face. She prayed for a long time. Eli thought that she was acting strangely and that she had been drinking too much wine. He rebuked Hannah and told her to go away and not to get drunk. I have not drunk wine nor any strong drink, she said. I am a very unhappy woman. I am crying to God. I have no son. Then Eli understood that she was grieved in her heart. He blessed her and prayed for her. God has heard your prayer, he said. Go in peace, and Hannah went away, sure that God would answer her prayer. The next day was the last day of their visit. The family rose early, worshipped before the ark of God, and made their way back to their home in Ramah. Not long after that, Hannah was so happy she knew that her baby was coming. At last, a boy was born. I will call him Samuel because it means God heard. When he is old enough, I will give him back to the Lord to serve in his house. I will dedicate him to the service of God. Now, Elkanah continued to go every year to worship the Lord at Shiloh. When the boy Samuel was able to make the trip, Hannah went again to her husband. They took an offering of thankfulness to the Lord, and they saw Eli. I am the woman who prayed for a son, she told him. This is the boy for whom I prayed. I am now giving him to you for the Lord's service. And in her happiness she praised the Lord and prayed to him. Eli's sons were evil men. God was angry with them, but Samuel grew into a fine lad who loved God and obeyed his laws. Every year, his parents went to worship before God at Shiloh, and every year, Hannah took a new coat for her son Samuel. Eli was growing old, and Samuel was always helping him in the service of the Lord. One night, when the lad had finished all his work, and before the lamp of God in the tent of worship went out, he lay down to go asleep. All was quiet. Then he heard a voice calling his name. Samuel, Samuel. Got up and ran to Eli to see what he wanted. I did not call you, my boy, and lie down again. Then the Lord called him again, Samuel. So he ran to Eli's bed. Eli said, I did not call you. Go and lie again. At the third time, he heard his name called Samuel. A third time ran to Eli. Then it was that Eli realized it was the Lord who was calling Samuel, he said. When you hear your name called the next time, say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. And that is what Samuel did. Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. So the voice came again once more. Trembling, Samuel said, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So God spoke to Samuel and told him that he was going to do. Then everyone in Israel knew that Samuel had been chosen by God to be his prophet. For God spoke often to Samuel after that, and Samuel became the judge of Israel. God punished Eli's weak son. Did died in a battle, and when the news came to old Eli that his son has died, and that the ark of God has been captured by Israel's enemies, the Philistines. Eli was so shocked, he fell off his seat. His neck was broken, and he died. The people of Israel had been defeated, and the ark of God was taken because they had failed to worship and to live as the Lord their God had directed them. Samuel told the people this, and he instructed them in the ways of the Lord. So they put away their other gods and asked Samuel to pray for them. Then they began to defeat the Philistines once more. The next story is a king for Israel. So Samuel lived at Ramah, and he judged the Israelites for many years, during which time God blessed them and kept them safe for their enemies. Samuel traveled around the towns and cities, visited the people, and taught them God's ways. One day, the elders of Israel came to Samuel. "You are getting old now, Samuel, and there is no one else like you to look after people. We want a king, just like all the other nations. So we are different in Israel," Samuel answered them. "Our king is the Lord. He has always looked after us when we obeyed him. Do you not the Lord God to be your king now? If you have a king, he will be like the kings of other nations. He will want to keep a trained army, and your sons will have to serve as soldiers. A king will want a lot of servants and horses and chariots. We will require you to give him the produce of your farms, and you will have to pay him heavy taxes." They took notice of Samuel's words. "We want a king," they repeated. Samuel prayed to the Lord, then he agreed to find them a king. There was in the land a rich and powerful farmer whose name was Kish. He had a son who was very tall, handsome, and strong. His name was Saul. One day, Kish sent his son out to find some of his donkeys, which had wandered away over the hills. But Saul and the servant who was with him could not find the donkeys anywhere over the mountains. Then at last they met a man who said to them, "Yes, I know where your donkeys are. They have been found. You may be looking for donkeys, but the people of Israel are looking for you. You are to be their king." That man was Samuel. God has told him the day before that the next day he would send to Samuel the person who was to be king. Samuel would meet him and would know just who it was to be. You can imagine Saul's astonishment. He was even more surprised when Samuel took him into a great dining hall where there were about 30 other guests waiting for him. He was given to the place of honor at the table and the best cut of meat to eat. He stayed with Samuel that night. Next morning, Samuel poured some oil on Saul's head to show that he was one anointed to be king of Israel. The Lord God filled Saul with his spirit, and he returned to his home having found the donkeys. After Samuel called all the people together, he reminded them on how God himself had saved them and delivered them from all their enemies. He reminded them that they had now asked for a king like other nations, and that God was not pleased because they did not trust him to look after them. Nevertheless, Samuel said, "I have found you the king you are to have." Saul was called out from among all the people and presented to them. All could see him because he stood taller than anyone else in Israel. So Saul was proclaimed the king of Israel. When the Ammonites came to make the people of Jabesh Gilead their slaves, Saul called men from all Israel to drive them out, and great victory was won. There were many more skirmishes with Israel enemies during Saul's reign. But the Lord God was not pleased with Saul because he did not always obey the Lord. He was not a happy man. He became irritable and miserable, especially when Samuel told him that God had now rejected him as Israel's king, and that another person would be chosen in his place. One day, when Saul was feeling particularly unhappy, his servant said to him, "If some sweet music were played to you, it would make you feel better. Let us find a skillful player of the harp, and when you feel unhappy, he can play for you, and you will be cheered up." Saul said, "Yes, find me someone who can play well, and bring him to me." A servant said, "I have seen one of the sons of Jesse, and he plays the harp beautifully. His name is David, the shepherd boy." So they brought young David to Saul, and from that time he used to play on his harp for the king whenever Saul was depressed. So this is David playing his harp for the king. The next story is David and Goliath. David loved to sing and play his harp. He also wrote a great many songs. We call them psalms. Christians still read and sing them in church today. They ensure us how much David loved and trusted God. When David was not playing his harp at Saul's palace, he worked as a shepherd boy on his father's farm. He was a fine-looking lad, could run fast, and he was very strong and brave. One day, a bear came and took one of the little lamb out of his father's flock of sheep. David ran after the bear, fought with him, and killed him. Another time, a lion stole one of the lambs. Brave David caught him by his hair, killed the lion, and saved the little lamb. The day came when David met giant Goliath. The Israelite army had gone to fight the Philistines. David's three eldest brothers went to the battle. So the Philistines were always making trouble for Israel that time. They raided their farms, burned their grain, and took away their cattle and possessions, killing and injuring people. One day, David's father, Jesse, called David. "I want you to go with a servant and take these 10 cheeses and this cornmeal to the captain of his fighting men and see how your brothers are." So David rose early next morning and leaving someone else to look after the sheep. He set off to the battlefield. He found the armies facing each other in the valley of Elah, shouting their battle cries. Leaving the servant of his bags, he ran to find his brother. As he was talking with them, he heard a great voice coming from the enemy ranks. A huge man clad in a brass helmet and with his body and legs covered with armor was standing in front of the enemy with a large sword at his side, a long spear in his hand, and shining shield in front of him. He looked a terrifying sight. His name was Goliath of Gath. His voice boomed out, and everyone listened. "Which one of you will dare to come and fight against me? I defy the armies of Israel," he cried. "Why are you all standing there? Just send me a man when we will fight together. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I kill him, you shall be all our servants and serve us." Excuse me. Now all the men of Israel were afraid of Goliath. Not one would dare go out to meet him. David looked around at Saul's army. "Is no one going to fight this Philistine?" he asked. "Is there no one who trusts God to help him defeat this man?" David's brothers were not very pleased with him for asking such questions. His eldest brother Eliah was very angry. "What did you come here for?" he demanded. "Who is looking after our sheep? You only came to see the battle? Why don't you go home again?" But David continued to ask, "What are we going to do about that man who is speaking against us and our God?" The king had promised the man who would fight with Goliath that he would let him marry his daughter, and he would give him riches and honor as well. Saul heard about David and sent for him. "If no one else will fight this man, I will go," said David. The king looked at David. "A young fellow like you cannot fight a man who all his life has been trained, like this terrible man, to battle and to war." Then David told Saul about the bear and the lion and how God had saved him out of their claws. Then Saul said, You cannot go like that. You had better take my armor." So David tried on Saul's helmet of brass, his coat of mail, and Saul's own sword. Said David, "I am not used to wearing all this heavy armor. I cannot fight this way." And he took it all off again. Taking his staff in his hand, he made his way out in front of all Saul's fighting men and came down to the brook which ran between the two armies. Then there he chose 5 smooth stones, which he put into his shepherd's bag, and advanced toward giant Goliath. Looking down on the young fellow, Goliath scolded as they came steadily nearer to each other. Goliath stopped. "Do you suppose that I am some kind of a dog," he roared, "that you come to me with a stick?" And he cursed David by his gods. Then David spoke, "You come to me with your sword, and with your spear, and with your shield. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of God in Israel, whom you have defied. Today you will be delivered into my hands. You will be struck down, and I will cut off your head. Everyone will know that there is a God in Israel. He will give you into our hands." These were bold words. David did not stop to talk with Goliath anymore, but straightway ran towards him. Taking a stone from his bag, he put in his sling, and with a mighty swing he let fly at the giant. His aim was true. The stone hit Goliath on his forehead with such force that immediately he fell flat on his face onto the ground. Then David ran forward, stood on the top of Philistine, drew Goliath's own sword, and cut off his head as he had said he would. Then watching Israelites were amazed and shouted with a great shout. The Philistines, seeing their champion was dead, turned and ran away with the men of Israel in pursuit. It was a great day of victory for Israel. King Saul made David the shepherd boy captain over his men of war. All the people loved David, and that day Saul his son Jonathan became David's great friend. So this is Goliath and David. The next story is Saul is jealous, which is in the book in 1 Samuel and starting in the 2 Samuel. So the enemies of Israel seemed always to be attacking them while Saul was their king. He sent David out of his commander to fight the tribe who came up to the war with Israel. Everyone loved David, but Saul was becoming jealous of the young man. He was angry when the women met David came back from the battle. They would sing and dance and play their tambourines. As they danced, this is what they sang. Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain in his tens 10,000. Saul said, "They are singing and saying that David has done better than I." they will be wanting him rather than me to be their king soon." Next day, Saul had one of his bad moods. So David played to him on the harp. But Saul was feeling so hateful in his heart then that music did not do him any good, and his jealousy of David was very great. His spear lay by him. Suddenly he snatched it and threw it at David. But David moved too quickly for him and darted out of his way. After that, Saul was afraid because he saw that the Lord was with David. "I know what will I do. What I will do," he said to himself. He told his servant to let David know that the king was pleased with him. "Tell him," said Saul, "that if he can kill 100 of Philistines, he may marry my daughter Michal." Now Saul thought that David himself would be killed before ever he could kill as many as 100 Philistines. But David went out and killed 200 Philistines and came back alive and well. So he was married to Michal, who loved him very much. Saul was even more afraid of David now. Surely the Lord was with David and helping him, and everyone loved David. Saul spoke to his servant and to Jonathan his son, and told him that he wanted David to be killed. Saul hated David, and he could not bear that everyone should like him. Jonathan, who was David's good friend, came to him and said, "My father wants you to be killed. Be on your guard." One day, Saul was feeling angry about David, who had just won another battle with the Philistines. He could tolerate David's presence no longer. David was playing music before Saul when the king suddenly took another lance of David with his spear. The spear stuck in the wall, and David escaped to his house and his wife. "You had better get away," she told him. "My father surely means to kill you." That very night, Saul sent his men to take David, but he had gone. He went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all about Saul. As soon as Saul heard that David was there, he came after him again. But David had played friend there also. He then met his friend Jonathan, who promised to help him. So David and Jonathan vowed to be friends and to help each other, whatever difficulties might come. When Saul heard that Jonathan was a good and true friend to David, he was very angry and hurled his spear at his own son to kill him, but again he missed. Jonathan then held a secret meeting with David. He told David that his father was more angry than ever. David had to keep away. They were both sad to have to separate. Tears were in their eyes as they prayed to the Lord God and promised to be true to each other. So David left his friend and escaped to hide in the hills and valleys of Israel. He came to a cave called the Cave of Adullam, and there many came to join him. Soon he had 400 men with him, and they protected the farmers' property whenever the Philistine raiding parties came to plunder and destroy the crops. But David could not stay in one place because Saul's men were looking for him. One day, Saul was out with 3,000 of his warriors. Saul came to a deep cave and took off his cloak and rested. Now David and some of his men were hiding farther back inside the cave. David's men whispered to him, "This is your chance to kill Saul. Let's go and do it now." David cautioned, "No, it is the Lord God who has anointed him king. I cannot kill the one God has anointed." Then David crept quietly up to where Saul had put his cloak and cut a piece from one corner. Later Saul picked up his cloak and went off his bodyguard to join the rest of the army. David came out to the entrance of the cave and called to Saul, bowed down to the king. "My lord, do not believe those who tell you that I want you dead," he cried. "You can see that I do not mean any harm to you. My men urged me to kill you. Look at your cloak. You will see there is a piece cut off the corner. I have it here." Saul realized that David had spared his life. We wept and thanked David, then he returned to his home. One day, news came to David that Saul and Jonathan had both been killed in a battle against Philistines. David was heartbroken. He wrote a song of sadness in memory of his dear friend Jonathan. He and his men then marched to Hebron, where they were reunited with their wives and families. There the people anointed David king of Israel in place of Saul. The next story is King David became a great and sins. When David became king, he had many problems. He wanted all people to work together so that the nation might be secure under God. The Philistines were defeated, and God blessed David and made the king of Israel great. His throne was moved from Hebron to Jerusalem, which came to be called the City of David. The Ark of God was brought back, and the people rejoiced. They had a great feast, and David worshipped the Lord. Then David said to Nathan the prophet, "I am living in a fine house, but we do not have a proper temple for our God in which we may worship him." God answered David by his prophet, "I have not needed a great temple all these years, but one shall be built. You shall not build my temple, David, because you are a man of war. Your son, who will be a man of peace, shall build my temple after you have died. Your family and your kingdom will be blessed in the days to come." On hearing this word, the king worshipped the Lord and thanked him for his kindness to him and his family. David and his mighty men fought and won more victories, so his kingdom grew and prospered. It was then that David decided not to go out with his men. He stayed in his comfort of his home in Jerusalem. Perhaps he was getting a little lazy. While his men were away fighting, he went up the flat roof of his house one evening and saw a very beautiful woman washing herself. He thought to himself, "I would like her to be mine." God's law says that we must not want other people's wives or husbands for ourselves. David did wrong and disobeyed God's law. The woman's name was Bathsheba, and her husband Uriah was away fighting David's battles. David sent his servant to ask her to come and see him. Then he loved her and sent her back to her house. A little while later, Bathsheba found that she was going to have a baby. She sent her servant to tell David, "Bathsheba is going to have a baby, and you are its father, because she went to bed with you when her husband was away fighting the Lord's battle." So David decided, "I will send for Uriah so that he may sleep with his wife. Then it will appear that the baby is his, and no one will know that I took his wife while he's away." But Uriah said, "No, I will not sleep with my wife while my fellow soldiers are out of the fighting of the Lord's battle." So David had to think again. He thought for another idea. He would write a letter to Joab, his commander-in-chief in the army. In the letter he wrote, "Put Uriah in a dangerous place when you attack so that he gets killed," and so it was done. So this was a very weak idea for David to have and very weak thing for him to do. By this means he had Uriah killed and he was able to take Bathsheba to be his wife. God was angry with David, as he shall see in the next story. So next story is Nathan talks to David. Joab received David's letter. In it, David instructed his commander to besiege the city was attacking, and to put Uriah in the hottest and fiercest part of the battle. Then he was to withdraw from the battle and leave him there. So Joab sent Uriah and his men where the enemy was the strongest. They came out of the city and fought against Uriah. Others shot arrows from the city wall, then killed some of the men of Israel and brave Uriah. So Joab sent a report back to David. The messenger was to tell the king that some men had died, and that Uriah had also died. David did not ask, "Why did you go to snare the city wall with only a few men?" No, instead he said, "Tell Joab not to worry too much. We must expect some men to be killed. Tell him that he will overthrow the city when he attacks it next time." Now David could have the wife of Uriah as his wife, which was the reason that he had wanted Uriah to be killed in the battle. God was not pleased with what David had done. When Bathsheba heard that her husband had been killed, she mourned for him afterwards. David took her into his house, and she became his wife, and the baby was born to him and Bathsheba. Nathan the prophet came to see David one day. He said, "I want to tell you about two men, David. One was rich, he had a large farm and plenty of everything. The other was poor, all he had was one little lamb. He loved this little lamb, it came into his house, he fed it from his own table, it played with his children, and he would nurse it on his lap. One day, a visitor called on the rich man, who had lots of sheep and lambs of his own. Instead of taking one of his own lamb to make a dinner for his friend, he took the poor man's lamb and left him with nothing. When David heard this, he was angry. He said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. Beside that, he shall give that man 4 times as much as he took, because he had no pity." David was so cross, he went red in the face. David and Nathan looked him straight in the eye as he spoke. "You are that man. The Lord God of Israel says to you, I have made you a king over my people of Israel. I've saved you out of many dangers. I have given you victories over your enemies. I have made you rich and prosperous. You have a good family and faithful servants. Have I not given you enough? Why have you disobeyed my commandment by arranging for Uriah to be killed in battle and taking his wife to be your wife? You will be punished, and everyone will know. Because you have taken Uriah's wife to be your wife, there will be trouble in your family. Because you despise me, you did it secretly, but all will see what will happen to you and your family." Then David knelt down before Nathan the prophet. "I have sinned against the Lord," he said. "God will spare your life and he will forgive you." Nathan promised, "You shall not die, but your baby who is born to you, you will certainly die." The enemies of God are laughing because of what you have done. It has brought terrible disgrace on the Lord God and his people. Nathan left David and went to his own house. The little baby born to Bathsheba did come ill. David was very sad, and he prayed all night on the ground. The baby did not get better. David's servants tried to comfort him and persuade him to eat. After 7 days, the baby died. The servants were afraid to tell the king that his baby had died. They thought that it would make him feel even worse than he already felt. They said, when the baby was alive, we could not comfort him at all. That will happen when we tell him that the baby was dead. He may do himself some harm if we tell him. When David saw his servants whispering together that he knew that his child had died. Then he asked him, "Is he dead?" They answered, "Yes, he is dead." Then David got up from the ground, washed himself, changed his clothes, and worshipped the Lord. He returned to his house and had a meal. David's servant said to him, "Your baby has died. You wept and cried when it lived, but now it has died. You are no longer sad." David said, "When he was still alive, who could tell whether the Lord would be gracious to me and make the child well? But now he has died, he cannot brought up back again. One day I shall go to him, but he will not come back to me." So David comforted his wife Bathsheba after the baby had died. Then God gave them another son. They named him Solomon. The Lord God sent David's friend, the prophet Nathan, to him with this message that the Lord loved Solomon and would bless him, so his other name was Jedidiah, which means love of the Lord. Solomon was to become the most wonderful king that Israel ever had. Absalom, next story is Absalom tries to be king. This is already in the 2 Samuel, Absalom. Yeah, and the King David becomes a great and sin. That's already in 2 Samuel. And Nathan talks to David. Absalom was David's favorite son. He loved Absalom. Absalom was a very attractive young fellow, handsome with lovely long hair. When it was cut once a year, it weighed about 5 pounds. Nathan the prophet had told David that there would be trouble in his family, and there was. Amnon was a half-brother for Absalom. One day, Amnon ill-treated Absalom's sister, Tamar, and made her very unhappy. Absalom would not forgive his brother Amnon, and when the opportunity came, he killed him. His father, the king, and all the family were very sad and wept bitterly. Absalom ran away according to the law. He should have been punished, and in fact, he should have died for what he did. But his father did not want him to die. After 3 years, the king agreed that he could come back to Jerusalem. But David would not see him, although Absalom wanted his father's forgiveness. After another 2 years, he did ask Absalom to come and see him. Absalom bowed down before his father, and the king kissed his son. Everybody liked Absalom. He was really good-looking and had a great charm. Absalom thought that he was now a person of importance in the kingdom. He provided himself with a fine chariot and horses and had 50 men to run in front of him. He wanted to be king of Israel. He used to get up early in the morning and stand by the road leading to the city. People came from all over Israel, and he talked to them. "If I can help you," he said, "let me know." So he made friends with many people from different parts of the country. They thought he was a nice and kind man. When he thought that he had gained many friends who would be on his side, he invited 200 of them to a feast in Hebron. During the feast, his close friend made a proclamation, "Absalom is king." The trumpet sounded, and Absalom sent messengers throughout the land saying, "Absalom is king." So the people were then quite convinced that this was true. Absalom's servants and friends took their swords to fight anyone who did not want to accept Absalom as their king. So King David's faithful servants told him that was happening and said to him, "We must get out quickly before they come to kill us." So King David and all the men who were faithful to him made their escape from Jerusalem. All the people who loved David wept when they saw him being forced to leave the city. A man named Ziba gave him and his men donkeys, carrying bread and raisins, figs and wine. As soon as David's men had left the city, Absalom and his followers entered Jerusalem and shouted, "Long live the king!" Then Absalom's chief advisers encouraged him to chase after his father and to kill him. But Hushai, another counselor who was really on David's side, said, "No." Hushai then sent David a message secretly to let him know that what was happening, so David was able to get right away. Other friends provided him and his men with flour, vegetable, and cheese, and they were able to rest from their journey. Soon, many more men came to join King David. Plans were made to defeat the rebellion and bring the proper king back to his throne in Jerusalem. They prepared for battle. David gave special instruction for Joab, his commander. "Be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake." All the troops heard David's instruction that his son Absalom was not to be killed. The time came for battle. Both sides met in the valley by the forest of Ephraim, and there was a great conflict between the men of Absalom and the men of David. The battle spread out and into the forest. As Absalom was on his horse galloping through the forest, a low branch caught his head and his long hair. He was swept off his horse, which ran on without him. Some of David's men saw him hanging there, and they told Joab, "Why did you not kill him?" cried Joab. "You heard what the king said," replied one of the men. But Joab did not listen. He ran with his armor bearers, and they killed Absalom where he was hanging from the tree. Joab sounded the trumpet to announce that the rebellion was over. A messenger came to tell the king that the battle was won. "Good news," he said. "God has defeated those who rebelled against you." David wanted to know, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the messenger replied, "May all those who rebel against you be like that young man." David realized that the son he loved was dead. He bowed his head in grief and went to his room and wept. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom," he cried. "If only I could have died instead of you, oh Absalom, my son, my son." Now Joab and his men and all the people who loved David were glad that the victory had been won for the king. They were glad also that David and his family and also his followers were saved. But when they heard that their king was grieving, they were sad too. Joab went to see David. "If you do not come and speak to the people who have helped you and fought for you," he said, "they will not want to follow you." David's heart was so heavy and he was very sad, but he rose himself and went out to see his faithful people. So that's the last story in the book of 1 Samuel and the 2 Samuel. So the next book is the book of Kings. Yeah, the book of Kings. 1 Kings and the 2 Kings. Yeah, that's the end of our story in the book of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And I will read the next story in the next video, which is the 1 King and the 2 Kings. Yep. Bye for now. I hope you like the story. God bless.